Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial election and looking at the polling data and what it means for this race. So as of right now, per 538's polling aggregate, Terry McAuliffe has a 2.5% lead over Glenn Youngkin in this race. So that is, I would say, less significant than what would have been anticipated 6 or 7 months ago. Mostly because, Joe Biden won Virginia by 10%. It was not particularly close. Even though there was some hype about, maybe Red Virginia is going to come back in 2020, it did not really even come close to developing. And Virginia, I know, it's kind of a weird state politically because it has so many interesting trends, and it's a lot to really dissect. And I do plan on making videos about states like Virginia in the future, but there's really a lot of things going on here between the D.C. suburbs shifting the state towards the Democrats, Virginia Beach getting more and more competitive and eventually going to be tilting blue. In the rural areas, people are wondering if they're maxed out for the GOP. So, Virginia, this election is going to be very interesting for me to see, more interesting than I would have thought maybe 7 or 8 months ago, back in the spring of 2021. Back in March or April, I would have been very hesitant to move this race down from likely a lean Democrat, but here I am, moved down to lean Democrat officially last week, and I think, that rating seems to be pretty solid right now. I haven't really seen any evidence that Glenn Youngkin is going to win, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I think it's more, I'll say this right now for the sake of people who are wondering. I believe that it is much more likely that Terry McAuliffe wins by over 5% than Glenn Youngkin wins. So it is more likely that this race does end up being a likely margin for Terry McAuliffe than Glenn Youngkin winning, and that's for a few reasons. So first of all, to take a look at the 2017 Virginia gubernatorial election, it was not particularly close. There was, even before the, what I like to call the 11th hour panic for Ralph Northam, there were polls that had Ed Gillespie within reach of this race, similar to what we see with Glenn Youngkin. So just take a look at the polling for this race. There were polls that came out, especially from Trafalgar, which I know in the past has overestimated Republicans greatly, especially in the Sun Belt. Polling company had Ed Gillespie ahead. They had him ahead again. Hampton had him ahead. These are really not really some well-known polls, but just to look at the most recent polls, if I can, here we go. The most recent poll, Fox News had Northam up by 5. Polling company, which again was it looks like a Republican internal. I didn't really see it in 2020, but I'm sure they were not great. They had they had Northam up by a point, and then a point ears. They had up by a point in a few polls. Monmouth had Ralph Northam, I keep wanting to call him Terry McAuliffe, up by 2%. And I think people were ready to welcome a competitive race in Virginia with a lot of alacrity. There was certainly, at least in 2017, I did not have this channel back then, but I paid attention to it a little bit. I didn't really care or know that much, but I remembered hearing about this race along with the special Senate election in Alabama. I followed this race a little bit, and I remembered wondering if the Republicans, if the Republicans are going to pick off the seat. And I, more than anything at the time, because I did not have really too many strong political views in 2017, I really kind of wanted to see a competitive race, because 2016 was such an exciting year for me. It was so interesting to see. In 2017, I just wanted to see a competitive race again, because it was a year since that chaotic election, and it was really quite interesting. So I think me and a lot of people, especially political geeks and political junkies, really wanted to see a competitive race, and I think to a certain extent that's what I want this time. It's, for me, competitive races, I guess, are good from a business standpoint. It helps me create more videos. It gives me more ideas. People want to watch my videos more. Like prior to the 2020 election, the 2021 Georgia runoffs, my channel had like an all-time high in views, and that is good for me. But it's, from a business standpoint, I want this race to be competitive. But yeah, now going back to what like I said this before, I think definitely on Twitter, maybe on videos. By the way, I'll plug my Twitter right now. I'm at UAP_YouTube. Go follow me on Twitter. What I will say is that people are always going to want to make these races more competitive than they actually are. It's out of boredom. It's out of the media kind of doing this, and the media doesn't really care that much about Virginia as much as they do about Afghanistan or about other things going on in the world right now. But it's still, at least the political media, but New York Times, NYT Politics, or Wall Street Journal opinion political, people are going to want to make this race more competitive because they want to get more people reading, talking about it, and thinking about it. So, the same thing with the California recall. We saw a state that was a Biden plus 30 state that was supposed to be a blowout for Newsom. It ended up being a blowout for Newsom. People were saying, oh, it's going to be within 10. There's a chance that the Republicans, I saw predictions that had the Republicans winning the California recall. It's like you can't make this stuff up. People actually thought that Republicans were going to win a race in California. People are going to do the same thing with Virginia. Now, Virginia is only it was a Biden plus 10 state as opposed to a Biden plus 29 state, but it still is a double-digit Democratic state. This is still a state that has not elected a Republican at the statewide level since 2009. Like, literally. The Republicans last won a gubernatorial election in 2009 with Bob McDonnell, and since then they have not won a race. 2009 was the last year, so, I was, well, I'm not going to say how old I was, but I was not paying attention to politics at the time, that's for sure. And I think a lot of you guys probably weren't either. So, in my political lifetime, I've never seen a Republican win a race in Virginia, and I've also never seen them even really come close to winning a race in Virginia. Like 2017 was probably like when I started paying attention to Virginia elections specifically, and I guess 2016 Clinton only won it by 3, but in terms of statewide elections in 2017, 2018, 2020, Republicans, the closest they really came was, I think, 2017 gubernatorial election where they lost by nearly 9%. In the 2018 Senate race, they lost by like 17. The 2020 presidential race, they lost by 10. I think Mark Warner won by like 11 or 12. So the Republican Party has really not been competitive in Virginia. I'm being nice. Like people say this about Ohio, like the Democrats. People consider Ohio to be more competitive, or to be less competitive than Virginia, even though the Democrats actually won a Senate race there in 2018. Even though they actually have won the majority or plurality of congressional votes there as recently as 2012. So, it's politics changes, but Virginia is a state that for the past 10 years and for my entire career, and I shouldn't say career, but my entire experience in covering and focusing on politics, Virginia has been a blue state. And I don't think it's going to change right now. And, for a few reasons. And first of all, looking at Joe Biden's approval rating, I get that it's not great right now. I get that he's not a very popular figure in America right now. But if you're telling me that 20, or I guess I should say 20% of Joe Biden's voters in 2020 are going to go to the polls on November 2nd and vote for a Republican candidate who has been tied to Trump repeatedly, I don't think that's going to happen. If I'm being completely honest with you, people aren't really changing their minds. America is polarized. The electorate does not make swing states for a reason. It's not because it's not because they want to make my job harder. It's because the American electorate is so polarized that we have just a handful of states and congressional districts that are going to be competitive, and we can make things like we can tell ourselves that things are competitive. Like we can, because we're so bored, we can say maybe this race is going to be competitive. Maybe I should stay up all night watching it instead of studying for my exam tomorrow, or we can actually focus on what the reality is, and we're saying, look, this is a semi-competitive gubernatorial election in a Biden plus 10 state. So that, yeah, sure, it'll probably be single digits, but I don't think it's going to be a flip 10 points in the other direction. It's just not. It's not likely. It's not impossible. I never say things are impossible, but it's very unlikely that Glenn Youngkin wins this race just because of the fundamentals. Unless Joe Biden has like a major scandal within the next week and a half, and his approval rating falls to 35%. I don't see this race really going anywhere. Sure, Glenn Youngkin's running a decent campaign. I'm not saying he's a bad candidate or anything like that. I'm actually saying the opposite. I think he's done, for the cards he was dealt, he's doing fine. But at the end of the day, are you really going to tell me that the Republicans are going to flip a seat in a Biden plus 10 state against a former governor who is well-known statewide, who people do not really have a problem with? No, it's just not likely. And if if Glenn Youngkin wins, I'll come back and I'll say, oh, well, look, I was wrong. But I'm telling you, there's not serious evidence that I'm seeing that the Republicans are going to win this race. It's just not likely. I think most people are saying Youngkin has but a 20% chance of winning. I've seen obviously people on Twitter are going to say he's going to win. It just there are people on Twitter who think Glenn Youngkin's going to win. There are people on Twitter who think Terry McAuliffe's going to win by 35%. Right? Like this is like. I do not like anecdotal evidence because people are going to have an inherent bias when they talk about anecdotal evidence. Like, in 2020, if I come up like I knew 6 people who lived in Ohio, and I said 5 of the 6 are voting for Joe Biden. Doesn't mean that Joe Biden's in Ohio. It just means that I have a flawed sample size. So, being realistic here, let's take a look at some of the numbers and break them down. So, again, polls aren't great, but, the most recent polls had McAuliffe by 5. Monmouth had it tied. I'd never seen this one. Schoen, Cooperman Research had McAuliffe by 4. The infamous Trafalgar group, which is not named as pollster, it's like a D+ pollster, had Youngkin up by 1. Fox News had Terry McAuliffe winning by 5. They're also winning by 11. Fox News is weird because, like, their network, like, the coverage is obviously conservative, but their polls always overestimate Democrats. It's a strange dynamic. YouGov, McAuliffe by 3. Christopher Newport University, never heard of it, McAuliffe by 4. Emerson had it tied on October 6th. September 30th, Fox had McAuliffe by 4. And then Roanoke College had McAuliffe up by 7. So every poll except for this one poll from Trafalgar had Youngkin up by 1. We'll certainly take a look at this poll. I'm more than happy to open it up and analyze it. But the one poll that I really want to address is from this 8 pollster, Monmouth University, sampled 1,000 registered voters. That's a decent sample size. And they had Glenn Youngkin at 46%. They had Terry McAuliffe at 46%. And when an A pollster comes out and says this race is tied, that's important. It's important we look at it. So, just to look at the crosses of this poll, which I enjoy poll analysis. It gives me great joy for whatever reason. I don't really know why. I just like it. It's cool, I guess. But so just to take a look at their overall thing, and it's for the record, I highly recommend people take up poll analysis. It's really not that hard. It's just reading a few numbers and then comparing them to other numbers that we get. It's important because, like, what happens too much is people just read the headline. They're like, oh my gosh, if we saw a poll that had, McAuliffe up by 175%, obviously that would be strange. It'd be peculiar, but, you gotta remember, you can't just read the headline. You gotta look at the cross-tabs. You gotta see how they're getting their numbers. You gotta see who they're surveying, because, like, if I were to, go to, Florida, which is, I guess I shouldn't say that because it's their home debate, but, like, if I went to, Pennsylvania, which is a swing state, obviously, and I asked 100 white voters who they're going to vote for, and 57 of them said they'd vote for Trump over Biden. It's, I would think, Trump's going to Pennsylvania easily, but, you got to sample proportional demographics. You can't just go to a state that's 30% black and then only have your poll only consist 4% of black voters. So you got to remember that crosstabs are important, and you can't just read the headlines. So for this poll, in October they had it tied. September they had McAuliffe up by 5. In August they had Youngkin down by 5. And in terms of range of electorate models, they said kind of like the best case scenario in their poll was Youngkin by 3, and then kind of reverse for McAuliffe by 3. So just to kind of look at what they're doing, I don't really care for the record, partisan engagement gap essentially just means which party wants to vote more, and it's always going to be the party that has the momentum, which changes. Like 6 months ago, it's probably the Democrats, now it's the Republicans. Votes are not weighted by how enthusiastic you are. Like, if someone goes to the polls, holds their nose, and votes for McAuliffe, it's weighed the same way as someone who has a Glenn Youngkin tattoo on their back, right? So it doesn't really matter. You can analyze this as much as you want. I don't really care about it. It was used in 2020 to say Trump's going to win because his voters are more enthusiastic. Like, that's probably true, but it didn't really come out that way. So, yeah. Now, just to go down here, let's look at the electorates they are sampling. So, the electorate they have is really not that bad. I think that I heard somewhere that, look, if 59% of the voters they sampled had no degree, like, if we just look at what happened in 2020 in terms of college education, which, again, college-educated voters broke for Biden by 17, they undersampled college graduates by about 2%, so it's not awful. It's certainly not, it's not favorable to Democrats, obviously, but it's, not terrible. It's not the worst that I've heard. I've seen way worse, like the Biden plus 17 poll in Wisconsin, but, not great, but it's not awful. Like, I'm not going to spend a whole video complaining about that. What I am going to spend a video talking about, though, is, so, as you can see, the first question is, if the election for governor was today, who would you vote for between Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat, or some other candidate with leaners? So, I'm just saying, like, by leaners, I guess they're just saying, like, I'm leaning towards Youngkin, they're just kind of going to count it for Youngkin. It doesn't really matter. But, essentially, like, if you look at the crosstabs, and I wish there was a way to zoom in, but I can't. If you look at the crosstabs right here, Youngkin won 61% of white voters in this poll, compared to 34 from McAuliffe. That's a 27% difference, and 27% for white voters isn't awful in like a state like West Virginia, but in Virginia, Joe Biden lost white voters by 8%. So this poll is suggesting that Glenn Youngkin is going to win white voters, or he'll have to win white voters by more than 19%, and he'd still be tied. So he'd have to win white voters by like 22 or 23% more than Donald Trump, and then he'd be winning by a point, with nothing else going wrong for him. And that's despite them undersampling college graduates, and just the poll in general being an outlier from the consensus McAuliffe plus 4 to 5 point lead. Again, I'm not saying that this poll is 100% wrong. It's not crazy. It's not saying Youngkin's going to win by 35. But what I am saying is that when you have a poll that has Donald Trump underperforming whatever I do not care who it is, any Republican by 19% of white voters, that is very, very flawed poll. Now, just to reiterate, Trump won white voters in Virginia by 8, and he was a candidate who was historically strong with white voters. He did very well with working class voters, especially those who were white, and he was the first Republican, I think, to win the white vote outright by, I think, over 15% nationwide or something, since, I don't even know. It wasn't even Bush in 2004. I think it was, Reagan or Bush. No, it was Bush in 1988. Either way, he did historically well. He was the first Republican, I think, to win working class voters since 1984, and he just did very well with white voters, and especially those who were working class. And so for this poll to come out and say, Glenn Youngkin can outperform Donald Trump by 19% with the strongest demographic, I find that very, very unlikely. And even with them outperforming Trump by 19%, it's still only he's still tied. He still is not even ahead. He still needs 46% of the vote. That's how hard it is for a Republican to win Virginia nowadays. He has to outperform Trump by 20% with white voters, and even then, he still can't have a leader come close to 50% of the vote. I also just want to point out that in these elections, it's probably more than 19% because where is 2017 Virginia exit polls? White voters, 67% of the electorate. They were the same in 2020. 67% of the electorate was white. But as you can see, one of the fastest growing groups in Virginia is Hispanics, and Hispanics are one of the groups that don't turn out if they make up maybe 10% of the state's population, they might turn out a little lower, 8 or 9% or 7% maybe. But Hispanics made up about a point more of the electorate in 2020 than they did in 2017, and they broke for Northam by 35, and they broke for Biden by 25. So they're a pretty strong group for Democrats. The Republicans are improving there, but they're still, Youngkin's still going to lose the Hispanic vote by at least 20. So, yeah. Now, this poll, like I said, not great, but I did promise I'd look at the crosstabs of this Trafalgar poll, and Trafalgar's, I'll be honest, I'm not really a fan of looking at their polls. That's mostly because they have they're not as transparent. They're kind of shady about their polls. That they don't really have a ton of really information that they can display. So that's why I don't like their polls. They also missed big in 2018, 2020, and 2016. They had two good polls in 2016, and they were a week before the election. They got Michigan and Pennsylvania right, and they're still off Wisconsin. They still won by 4. But I think that they kind of had a lucky, a broken clock is right twice a day thing in 2016. In 2018, they overestimated Republicans nationally by I think 7%. And them along with Rasmussen, Rasmussen had the Republicans winning the national environment actually by a point, and they had by D+1 or D+2. So Trafalgar is their Republican internal poll. It's run by Republicans. It's a poll that I don't really like, but we'll analyze it. So actually, I tweeted about this, but as I said, I was not when this came out on the 15th. It said not a huge fan of this poll. Number one, Joe Biden does not only have a 40% approval rating in Virginia, because this poll did have Joe Biden winning or having an approval rating of 40%. That would mean that his approval rating is, I think, 3 or 4 points lower in Virginia than it is nationally, which makes no sense at all. I think his approval in Virginia is probably 50 to 45 or something like that. Nationally, he's definitely underwater, though. So if Joe Biden's down, if he's at 40% in Virginia, the Democrats are probably losing this race, but that's just not what's happening right now. Now, secondly, this poll understands black voters by 3%. And that may not seem like a big number, but when black voters, especially in the South, have been a key part of the Democratic coalition for a very long time, and that is important for them. Democrats need black voters to turn out, and this poll does not. They understand black voters by 3% of the 2020 electorate, which does not really make a ton of sense to me. So on top of this, for Youngkin to win by a point using these numbers, you have to win whites by 30%, which is highly unlikely. Now, as I said, the poll, his best poll of white voters that actually had him tied or was actually semi-realistic, had him winning by 27, which is a 19 point out performance. So if he has to win whites by 30% using these numbers in a Trafalgar poll, that's never a good sign if you're a Republican. I'm not saying that he's doing a bad job of his campaign. Like I said, Glenn Youngkin is running a better campaign than Terry McAuliffe, and he's, for the cards he's dealt with, he's outperforming. But at the end of the day, it's not easy to win as a Republican in Virginia. So I think that'll wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please smash that like button. I've not really been posting because my views have been down because I've been super busy. I think, like I said, I think I'll be able to post a little more normally starting in November. But yeah, so please do hit that like button. I really would appreciate it, and comment down what you think about this race. Thank you. I'll see you all in the next video.